I love that. I love that. And I have had a number of readers who read advanced copies say by the end of the book that they have actually slowed down because they didn't want to leave that world. They felt as if they had been put into a place that they loved and didn't want to leave. And it's the place, but it's also the people and the characters. But it does create a little bubble of a world that's just off to the side of the real world that people get immersed in and then kind of don't want to leave. I also wonder if, starting as a food writer maybe doesn't help with that, because food writing does require such specific descriptive language, describing tastes and smells and mouthfeel and, just the pure sensuality of eating food. First of all, it's done so much that you can't do it lazily because everybody else has already done it lazily. If you're gonna stand out, you have to do it in a new way, and you have to think really hard about just really exactly what that taste is or what that smell is, not just the first thing that comes to mind. So I wonder maybe if food writing didn't help with that sort of establishing the world or creating a sensual place for the reader to inhabit. Maybe did come a little bit out of starting out as a food writer.
Everyone, welcome back to Living the Next Chapter. Yet another amazing author on the podcast. Just launched his book and had some great feedback already, some great sales, some good feedback on the book as well as awards, of course, because why not, right? A season for that, Lost and Found in the other southern France. Steve Hoffman is on the podcast. And once you see this book, you're going to fall in love with it because of the book, but also the imagery in here as well. Some good stuff to talk about. Steve, welcome to the podcast. Glad to have you here.
Thank you, my friend. It's so good to be here.
It's awesome. I have a copy of the book myself. I'm holding it. I'm loving it. And for those listening, that's the book. It's beautiful, by the way. And the one thing I wanted to talk about right off the bat, Steve, you mentioned there's a helper for you that's done the imagery in the book and the photos. Tell us about your assistant. Who is this great person?
Yes, she's much more than my assistant. She is my superior in almost every way. Happens also to be my spouse of 35 years, who's an artist photographer awesome. Who actually just published her own book in May. So good. We've both taken about 10 years of sort of working on our creative careers while we were also holding down a family life and more traditional careers, and they both projects sort of bore fruit in the same year, which is really, really fun.
Awesome. Well, she has an amazing eye. She has a gift. And the two of you working together on your new book is amazing. So
it's really fun.
Well done on that.
Thank you.
I was telling you, when the book arrived, we were very thrilled. It's a beautiful book, first of all. For those who haven't seen it yet or held it, it's just gorgeous. The problem is you caused some marital strife for myself and my wife as we wrestle over who gets the book first. So thanks, Steve. That's so kind of you to do that.
I'm not often happy to cause marital strife, but in this case, I'm quite happy.
It's excellent. Steve, tell me, how did all this start? How did the book begin? What was the seed for all this?
Sure. The book began in 2012 when our family, my wife and I, our two kids, our daughter 14, my son 9, went and spent an extended fall semester in a tiny winemaking village in southern France. In the other southern France, where the title comes from, means the west of the Rhone. So not the more sort of popular, extremely touristed, quite glamorous Provence and Riviera, but the Languedoc-Roussillon region, which is much poorer, and in some ways more authentic and cooler in its way, but also, not what you think of as southern France. So we were there for those 6 months. The kids went to the local schools, and Mary Jo and I were sort of along for the ride at first, and then realized that we wanted something more to happen. And the things we tried to make happen were to make an extra effort to actually be a part of this village and its life and culture, and in my case, food and wine culture, and also came up with this sort of idea that we called practicing for retirement, which was, in the busy middle years, we had not had a lot of time to sort of step back and think strategically about our lives and about what was going to come after this busy second act. And we realized at some point this was an opportunity to do that. And she had always loved photography and art. Mm-hmm. I had always been a lover of books, writing and literature. And so she started a photography project during that time, and I started keeping an extensive journal that was essentially the origins of my food writing career and became ultimately the origins of this book.
It's amazing. We have listeners in France. Would you like to greet our listeners in France, Steve? Because I'm sure they'd love to hear a non-English greeting in a podcast. You had to pick up something living in this.
You're Canadian.
Community.
You should be able to do this too.
Oh, I need to dust it off for sure.
Avec plaisir. C'est un grand plaisir d'avoir des auditeurs français. Et moi, j'ai appris mon français à Paris. J'ai fait un stage à Paris quand j'avais 23 ans. Et depuis, je suis vraiment francophile.
Wonderful. I picked up on a lot of those words. Being here in Canada, that's we're two official languages, and I'm really okay at one and I'm not very great at the other. So it's excellent that you can pull that out, Steve, and just do that. That's amazing. So
I worked very hard on it for a very long time.
Excellent. What was it about that community in particular that caught your attention and drew you there? You could have gone anywhere in France. Why that specifically?
Honestly, we weren't so much drawn to that particular community. Okay. There was a randomness, or at least a deliberate lack of extensive planning associated with this entire endeavor. Okay. We knew that we wanted to be in the South because we live in Minnesota, and which is makes beautifully cold winters. We wanted to spend a fall semester somewhere where it would be at least somewhat warm, and much of France is not particularly warm in those fall months. So we knew we wanted it to be the South. And then at some point, we chose Languedoc because it was more affordable. And at some point, we really just sent out, this was before Airbnb, before, any sort of much in the way of online services. And we just began looking on English websites for long-term rentals in France, didn't find much. At some point, did a search on long-term rentals in France in French, on French websites, and got several replies back. One of them happened to be in this tiny 800-person winemaking village from an Irish landlord. And he seemed legit. The place looked nice. It was big enough to house all of us. He was willing to take us for 6 months. And it kind of happened like that. So it wasn't, we didn't sort of do our research and say, okay, this is the village that we definitely want to live in. We somewhat deliberately let chance intervene. And then, when we arrived, it wasn't really what we expected in many ways, which was both a blessing and a curse.
What was the impact on this adventure for your kids? How did they change?
They were, I would say two things. One is we quite deliberately established a comfortable home life while our kids were around. I like to cook. I like to put a meal on the table. I wasn't very good at it. Part of this adventure was, in fact, learning to truly cook instead of just follow recipes. But we had tried. My wife, Mary Jo, had a career as an aerospace engineer that she quit in order for one of us to be home. I was Mr. Mom, actually, for the first 4 years of our daughter's life. And then at some point, we sort of slapped hands, and she jumped out of the ring and I jumped in. But we had made some very deliberate decisions to be a family and to make time for that as the center of our lives, which is a long way of saying the kids had a place to retreat to. They had a refuge in the family and in the house with us while they were being challenged on this adventure. However, I would still say that they were at least somewhat resistant. Our daughter was 14, and social life means an awful lot at that age. She was sure that she was missing some really important stuff at the school lunch table while she was eating, perfect peaches in southern France. So they were receptive to the extent that they did it. They plunged in. They actually became good students. They had both taken French extensively in school. They'd actually gone to a French immersion school, so their French comprehension was quite good. But I would still say, again, it wouldn't have been their first choice. And what's been fun, I think, is to see that, we were very concerned that we had asked too much of them, that this is going to introduce more trauma than sort of adventure into their lives. And there was a period afterwards where we were just sort of kind of coasting and being a fairly average American family, and they were off being teenagers. And just now, with our son at age 20 and our daughter at 26, we're watching them, without really making much of a point of it, taking back up much of what they learned to do and to be during this trip. Our son loves to cook. He loves sort of spirits and fermentation. Our daughter is an extensive European traveler. wants to now learn Italian because she's fallen in love with Italy and Sicily. And so there were times when we thought, well, this is a nice little adventure, and the kids got some good stuff out of it. And that was about it. And now I feel as if I'm seeing evidence that it's actually affected them more deeply and in some sense brought them closer to us because, of course, the things that we were doing in this trip are the things that Mary Jo and I love the most. Yeah. And to have them rediscovering those things kind of along with us as adults has been very, very rewarding.
Steve, would you say this book is a great book for anybody who wants to dream a little bigger, expand their world beyond their community and where they live and grew up? And I haven't been 10 miles out of my community ever. I just want to dream big and live big. Is that kind of an ideal person for this book?
I think so. I mean, yes, it's the classic, what if we just threw it all away and went off? There is an element of that to this. And there was this sort of whimsy about it at first where, like I said, it wasn't overplanned. And we did take some risk and we didn't know what was going to be waiting for us on the other side. And so I think that is fun, even if you never want to go on an adventure like this. To read about it can be fun. Just how did this happen? How did they manage to pull this off? And then what happened to this family that was plunked in the middle of a obscure rural region of southern France where no English was spoken, and life was very unlike what they had grown used to as middle class Americans. But I would also say it's also. So it's a story of our, kind of acceptance into this village. But it's also very much a story about being a parent, about being a little bit agonized, about feeling this love for these kids and yet knowing that you're asking them to do things they don't want and that it might alienate them. And so I would say it's an adventure book. It's certainly a travel and food and wine book, but it's also very much a book about being in a collaborative long-term marriage and about the decisions and the difficulties and sometimes heartaches that happen by just simply being a parent.
Talk a little bit about the acceptance of the community of you as a family outsider moving into their tiny, tight-knit community. Who are these strange Americans that have infiltrated our beautiful town? Who are these crazy people that moved all the way over here for this period of time? How was the acceptance from them to you as well?
It's a great question. They because we could speak French, that eased a lot of that transition. There was such a sort of surprise and then almost gratefulness that we were willing to speak their language. So that got us in a little deeper, a little quicker. However, it was still an 800-person village. It was like an extended family, really, more than it was a village. And there was some insularity that we had to overcome. And early in the trip, I think French for me had always been a sort of a costume that I put on. It was a little bit of a persona that I put on. And I was this different, better, more worldly and sophisticated human being when I was speaking French in France. And I would have been, I think, more comfortable just sort of letting it be this pretty little thing that we did together and then coming home. And at some point, Mary Jo kind of called me, and she's a very good at calling me on my BS and my ego. And at some point, and God bless her for it because I need it. But she said, this is not working. This is not what we signed up for. The kids and I did not sign up for the Steve Hoffman show to follow you around and watch everybody admire your beautiful French. We're asking something extraordinary of these kids, and I can't make this happen because I don't speak French like you do. In fact, I don't. She speaks very little French in a sort of conversational way. Her vocabulary is quite large, but she doesn't speak French in that sense. And so really very early in the trip and very early in the story, she sort of offers me this ultimatum, which is, fine, you can do this your way and you can be admired and we can leave and everybody will remember, that Steve was this nice guy who spoke good French. At which point, I'm not all that interested in France if that's what this is going to continue to be. Or you can step out of your comfort zone and try to bring us in and try to make this something where we actually integrate and become a part of things. And I was faced with that, and it was sort of very much the early turning point of the entire endeavor because I didn't want to leave my comfort zone. I was very, very comfortable being admired for my French accent and having espresso at the cafe. But I was not willing to consider having France not be a part of me. That has been a huge sort of pillar of my adult persona. And so at some point I had to shift from being somebody who gave off the impression of knowing a lot to asking a lot of questions and giving off the impression of somebody who was full of wonder and ignorance. And that was a very hard transition, but it also opened up an enormous amount of doors. And that was the start of our becoming, our moving from being the Americans in town that everybody was sort of half aware of to being Steve and Mary Jo and Joseph and Eva, whom they knew as people.
Yeah. What was your orientation, original thing that got you curious and interested in the French community and learning French? Like, again, I'm trying to put two and two together here. What was that origin story for you that even captured your desire to learn French culture?
Yeah, it started very early. I started taking French in sixth grade. And then took it throughout my junior high school, and college career. So it'd been a part of my school work, a fairly significant part of it for a lot of years. For whatever reason, my last name is Hoffman, spelled with one N. My mother's maiden name was Hoffman, spelled with two N's. So by all rights, I should have taken German, but I didn't have any interest in it. I didn't think it was a pretty language, and I thought French was a pretty language. Yeah. And then by just a fluke of genetics, which is nothing I can take any credit for, I happened to have a good accent. My mouth made French sounds fairly easily right from the start. And so I was getting this sort of ego boost from having a good accent as I was also learning the language. And then I took in my what would have been my junior year of college, I took a year off, spent 9 months in Paris. I did an internship with an outfit called the Little Brothers of the Poor, which also had a fraternity in Minneapolis, where I'm from, and where I had volunteered and my parents had been on the board. So my job in Paris for 9 months was to spend 4 or 5 afternoons a week visiting 2 or 3 elderly people in their homes in Paris and just talking to them. Wow. That was the mission. They weren't set up to give financial assistance. Sort of the French state would do that, but there were a lot of very lonely people whose spouses had died or who were single for whatever reason, and just needed company. So you can imagine it was, simply the most accelerated French conversation course you could possibly imagine. Yeah. And I really went at that time from being a French student to being a French speaker. At the same time that I was doing what we had talked about earlier, which is inhabiting this new persona who was no longer a suburban kid from Minnesota, but this young gentleman striding the streets of Paris, able to be a part of a world capital. And that whole package was just completely intoxicating for me and made me a lover of French and France for the rest of my adulthood.
I love when someone who can speak fluently in another language and people don't anticipate that you can, and they talk in their language thinking you have no idea what you're talking about. Yes. And you can turn and respond to them, and the look of shock and awe that, oh my goodness, you've heard every word I've said in my language.
Absolutely.
And you understand me. That must be fun.
I've never caught any egregious insults from the metro seat behind me. Yeah. But I've heard some wonderful stories.
Those Americans or those Canadians, look at them there.
Exactly.
Right.
Yep.
Oh,
yeah, right,
bonjour. Right. You're like, oh no, wait. Okay. Yeah. So that's pretty interesting. I love that. Steve, talk us through the book. What are we going to find? I'm holding it again because I love it. What are we going to find as readers as we go through here? One of my questions to my guests I always like to ask is, for a new reader to your book, holding it, what's your love letter to me as a reader? What do you want me to know before I start reading this book?
I want you to know, first of all, that it, both to my credit and my detriment, it matters very, very much to me that the surface of the writing of the book is beautiful. So I try very, very hard to cut out all lazy language and any sort of coasting or drifting. I really like my favorite authors tend to have that kind of sparkling surface to their writing. Vladimir Nabokov and John Updike and J.D. Salinger to some extent. Those Annie Proulx, those writers that just sort of you don't even need to be liking the story. The language is just going to carry you along. I'm not going to promise that that I have those sorts of gifts, but that is at least one promise that I think I could make, and one love letter I could send to the readers, which is I worked very, very hard to make this the kind of thing that if you respond to the story, wonderful, and I think a lot of people will. But even if you don't, there's going to be a sort of pleasure in just immersing yourself in the current of the language and letting it pull you along. And the second thing, I guess, the love letter I would say is that it took 10 years for me to write this book. And those 10 years were spent, for one thing, learning how to write a book at the same time that I was writing a book. So it felt like, preschool and graduate school all at the same time. And there could have been several points where I'd let the book go, and it would have been a pretty book and a well-written series of vignettes. And at some point, I wasn't willing to do that. It wasn't yet saying what I felt needed to be said about this very life-changing experience that we had had. And the other promise I guess I would make, or the other love letter I would send to the reader, is I had to become a little bit humble, and I had to recraft the way I wrote so that I was telling a story that was trying to communicate with the reader rather than simply writing in a way that was a form in some sense of showing off. So I had to go back sort of to square one and really learn how to tell a story. I didn't take many classes. I'm mostly self-taught, but I did at some point actually take a screenwriting class, so that what that would do for me, I hoped, was eliminate all this trying to make pretty turns of phrase, because that doesn't matter in screenwriting, and instead tell a story that made the reader want to turn the page and that had a narrative momentum to it. And I worked very hard at that, and it took a lot out of me. It took me recognizing the kind of writer I was, realizing that was a relatively successful writer, but not a finished writer, and then kind of going back and doing some hard work to become a more complete writer that could put a book out into the world that had both of those strengths, both the structure and narrative strength, as well as a strength of the quality of language.
What I like when I'm reading through it is I feel like I'm in your home with you. I feel like I'm at the dinner table. I can hear the sounds of knives cutting and the smell of food. And
I love that.
I hear the kids running around and all that. I feel like I'm there with you as a reader. When I'm out in the community, I feel like I'm there with you. Like, you really bring me into the story as well. I think that's the thing that a lot of authors struggle with, is how to create that connection between reader and author. And so that we feel like we're not just reading something passively, but we're actually in with you, walking the streets side by side. I have a lot of authors that listen to the show, Steve, and they're trying to master that, or trying to get their mind wrapped around how to do that. Do you have any tips for us on how we can do that as authors?
Boy, that's a great, very hard question. Yeah, I don't know. Okay. I do know exactly what you're talking about, which is that a lot of times you sense that you are being told a story. You're being guided by a narrator. And I have noticed that recently in a couple of books by some authors that I actually respect very much. But I still had the feeling that I was being told this story and was being directed by a narrator on how I should feel about things. And if I succeeded at that, I couldn't be more thrilled. And yet I don't know that I know how I did that. Other than, I think, I do think I tried writing early in my life and gave up twice. I tried to write short fiction in my 20s and tried to write poetry in my 30s and gave up, knowing somehow that it wasn't working and not knowing why or how. And something did happen during this trip when I started journaling extensively, and that's what turned into this book. And I found some kind of authority. I was speaking with a voice that I felt immediately was me, was who I was. And there was an authority to it that I hadn't ever had before. And boy, do I wish I could convey that the secret to that. But I don't know. I don't know how to help anybody else do that. I think it's one of the great struggles of being a writer is people talk about voice all the time, about being yourself, as if that's something that you can just do. And it's the hardest thing. Writing a story is actually, that's also extremely hard, I think. But there are steps, there's training and techniques that you can use to let a story unfold. And then at some point, the question is, are you being authentic on the page? Does the reader recognize that a great story is being unfolded and that they could trust this narrator to hold up their end of the bargain and keep it interesting and keep it moving. But they also want, I feel like they want to know this person. They need to feel that this writer is somebody that they can empathize with and that they have access to, who's letting them in, and letting them understand who he or she is and feel like they're invested in the change that's inevitably going to happen in any book. I think it's the hardest thing. Voice is such a difficult thing because it involves a self-knowledge that's not about writing at some point. It's about one thing I said late in this process, where I had struggled for many years kind of writing and rewriting the same book, which is I was trying to I was trying to eloquent my way out of a problem that eloquence couldn't solve. Yeah. And I did realize, with the help of a writing story coach, at some point realize I didn't have to be a better writer to finish this book. I had to be a better human being. And that meant being vulnerable. And that meant not having my writing persona be somebody who knew it all and who was showing off, but somebody who was open and struggling and didn't have all the answers. And I do feel like there's something about that speaks to whatever success this book will have. That was a major transition for me as a writer.
Maybe you don't need to explain how to do this because you've done it. So now all we can say is everyone just go buy the book and you'll see how to do it instead of having Steve explain to you how he did it. Because the one thing I get when I read books sometimes is like, oh, let me tell you about the story when I lived in the south of France. And that feels like far away, distant. I've never been there. I have no context to what you've done in your book, where I feel like I'm in the south of France with you as you're telling me the story. That's a totally different feeling for me as a reader, because I don't have to go there to get context. You give me the context. You give me the background. And I feel like I'm there. I'm not reading about some faraway place. So you've done it.
I love that.
So
I love that.
Just use this book as an example.
I have had a number of readers who read advanced copies say by the end of the book that they have actually slowed down because they didn't want to leave that world. They felt as if they had been put into a place that they loved and didn't want to leave. And it's the place, but it's also the people and the characters. But it does create a little bubble of a world that's just off to the side of the real world that people get immersed in and then kind of don't want to leave.
Yeah.
I also wonder if, starting as a food writer maybe doesn't help with that, because food writing does require such specific descriptive language. You have, describing tastes and smells and mouth feel and, the just the pure sensuality of eating food. First of all, it's done so much that you can't do it lazily because everybody else has already done it lazily. If you're gonna stand out, you have to do it in a new way, and you have to think really hard about just really exactly what that taste is or what that smell is, not just the first thing that comes to mind. So I wonder maybe if food writing didn't help with that sort of establishing the world or creating a sensual place for the reader to inhabit. Maybe did come a little bit out of starting out as a food writer.
I get the sense your food writing has crept into many of the parts of the book. I just seems to be like this little, you ever have that weed or that vine that just keeps growing out of nowhere? It's like, how did you get here? Like you're over there and now you're over here. Same I'm finding for your book. I'm finding these food references and stuff just creep out of the crevices all over the place. And you're like, wow, that really works here, but I didn't realize that it's connected to something way over there. So I see that.
Yeah, I mean, food has been a big part of my life, and of course became more so on this trip. And it's part of my love of France. Is the love of it's really talking about French food is sort of silly at this point because it's the foods really of France. France is a collection of regions. It's not really an entity, a monolith at all. But yes, a huge part of my love of France is its tradition of both high and low food. It's haute cuisine restaurant genius that it more or less invented, and then it's deep respect for what happens in family kitchens. And those are two opposite ends in some sense of the world of cooking. And in a beautiful way, the cultural history of France has learned to revere both of them.
It's good. You've had some early feedback and some results from your book going out into the world, as recent even as last night.
Yes.
Some great feedback from readers. Can you give us a little bit of sense of this? Because the reason I'm asking is I have authors who are trying to promote their new book. They're trying to make plans for the launch of their book, and they're always eager to learn from another author that's done this. Can you give us some insight to what you've done recently and some of the results?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the good news, the headline news really is that just yesterday it launched. It was the publication day yesterday. Had a great launch party locally that I was hoping to have 50 to 75 people show up for and sell 20 or 25 books, and 100 plus people showed up, and we sold 70 books in addition to the pre-purchased books that everybody had gotten from Amazon that day and brought in to have signed. So the day one, and then just as of today, I just got word from a friend of mine that the book is up. Amazon, this doesn't mean as much as it sounds like it should mean, but it is a number one bestseller in one of the categories on Amazon, which is, after thinking 5 years ago that this might never be published at all, that's quite a thrilling event. But here's, I think, what I would say is every writer I spoke to about what happens after you finish the book said, your publisher is not going to be the one that sells this book for you. You have to be the one who sells your book. You have to drive that train. And in my case, I mean, I have one of the big American publishers, Penguin Random House. They've been great. They've assigned me a team of four-person marketing and publicity team.
Great.
They've done their thing. They've got a huge list of contacts. But they're busy, and they're Lucy in the chocolate factory with that conveyor belt going faster and faster. And there's at some point you have to recognize that you're not the center of their world, that you have to make this happen for yourself. And so, fortunately, I'd sort of gotten that message early. I'm not sure I really believed it, but then I did start seeing that was the case. And so my wife Mary Jo and I really took the bull by the horns and said, okay, this took 10 years. It would be a shame not to make it sell. And so I've been very, very active on social media. I've tried to avoid this fear that I was over introducing myself to the world and that people were going to get sick of Steve Hoffman. It seems to have been just the opposite. Lots and lots of posting, lots and lots of photographs, lots of eye candy, lots of again being vulnerable on social media as well, being a human being there rather than just a face and a figure. And then reaching out to everybody that I can think of, that I have a relationship with, who is in the food world, the wine world, the publishing world, and recognizing that I have this Minnesota nice guy persona that I'm going to have to get over. And at some point you have to ask people to help you. And a surprising number of people do want to help you and can help you. And I've had to do a lot of big asks, a lot of calling in favors, and leaning a little bit on some goodwill that I built up with people. And you just have to. It's the only way that you can get books to sell, because people are busy, they're overwhelmed, they don't have time, they don't have attention spans, and you have to sort of barge into their lives a little bit.
Yeah. Well, having a book definitely gives you that opportunity to barge into their life, as you say, because now you have something to put in front of them that's a value, right? It's something
which helped,
people,
and
right?
Really one of the biggest things that we did do, and that Penguin Random House was very helpful with, is sending out a huge number of advance copies, so that it's easier to approach somebody who's a little bit more famous than you are, and you figure they probably aren't going to have the time of day to answer a question or do a joint event with you or whatever. But if you can just simply email them and say, I would love to put you on the VIP list to receive an advance copy of my book. Nice. It's remarkable how many people would at least get back to me, and I would have their attention. And then if they love the book, wonderful, then maybe something breaks free from that, something kicks loose. But it was a wonderful way of approaching people who had more influence than I did, and whose influence I was frankly trying to borrow, to simply say, I'd like to send you a copy of my book for free. And it's low pressure. They can say yes because it doesn't cost them anything. And even if they don't want to read it, they don't have to. But that opened a huge amount of doors. And we probably sent out, I would say, 100 copies of the book in advance to people who we considered to have high influence, not necessarily influencers in the current social media context, although those too, but just simply people who had an audience and whose opinions people respected. And we tried to get the book into their hands, and that started to pay some dividends with them now posting and talking about the fact that they are reading the book or have read the book and are really enjoying it.
Yeah, and that's why I love podcasting for authors, because now we hear your voice as the author. We hold your book in our hands. You've given us your love letter today. We know more about the story, and we feel a bond with you. We've been listening to you now for 38 minutes. We have this connection with you as a reader that we don't get necessarily on social media because it's so transactional, and it's up against, you are up against a cat video and which one am I going to watch today?
That's exactly right.
So this is a little more intimate, that we can build this foundation and have a more in-depth conversation around your book. So,
And honestly, I would put in a plug right now. So Michelle Glogovac, who set up this interview with us. In terms of, again, just simply advice for writers who are trying to get their books sold, Michelle has started a company called I always get it wrong, MLG Collective, where she sets up essentially a virtual book tour but it's just podcasts. And that's been one of the most valuable outlets for getting the word out, because there's lots and lots of podcasts and podcast hosts. They all, there's a big need for just content for people to talk, and it's generally free, and the host wins and I win as the guest. And we get to have these kinds of conversations instead of those 3-minute bites. I've been on radio and TV a couple times, and you're just sort of spitting out a little bit of a talking point, and then you're back off the air. And to be able to have this kind of a conversation where we go in depth has been hugely valuable. And I would just say, if writers are looking for maybe a little bit of a different angle where it's not traditional media, but it's really, really valuable, Michelle Glogovac at MLG Collective has been just a godsend. And she just works so hard, and she's so genuine. And she has really done as much alone on her end to get this book out in the world as a 4-person team at a major American publishing house has done.
She's amazing. Yeah.
She's truly amazing.
Yeah. So she'll be smiling and maybe wiping away a tear in the moment, but it's all true. It's not made up. It's all true. As far as how we connect with you, Steve, I notice you have all your links for social media and even your LinkedIn. Everything's here on your website. Can you tell us, again, send us to your website, and I have one more question as we end off today.
Absolutely, yeah. So my website is just www.sjrhoffman.com. That's as in Stephen John Raymond Hoffman. I'm also very active on Instagram. That's probably the most active social media site, but I try to make it, I have a very sort of interactive relationship with my followers. I still know most of them by name, and that is also at SJR Hoffman, Stephen John Raymond Hoffman. And the book itself is available in North America, really almost anywhere. Amazon's easy, but there's lots and lots of bookstores now where it should be able to be found in most locations.
Excellent. So grab a glass of beautiful French wine.
There you go.
Go out on the patio and grab the book.
That's right.
And have some me time as you read Steve's book. Steve, the name of my show is Living the Next Chapter. So I have to ask you as we leave. The book is out, and I know we don't want to be too quick to go on to the next thing, but I'm always curious for a published author. How, beyond promoting this amazing book, how are you living your next chapter? What's kind of down the road? Have you got future plans?
I think it's very much related to what happened 10 years ago, which is that my wife and I both established creative careers as part of this trip that's described in the book. She started an art and photography career. I started my writing career. We have always dreamed about being a collaborative, creative couple. And we each had a hand in each other's books this go-round. I think we both dream a little bit about a creative life that involves true collaboration, where we would work on a project together. And I think that could involve her writing about art and the creative process, with me helping co-author, or me writing something that would be more deeply illustrated by her art and photography than the current book was. But I would say it'd be a collaboration with my 35, now going on 35-year marriage with my spouse. That would kind of be the dream right now.
So I would love to offer the extension to her to come on the show as well. I would love to have her come on and talk about her works as an author.
She would love it too.
So keep us in mind. I'd love to have that happen. But Steve, thank you so much for the book. Thank you that I have a copy, and now My wife's at work, so I can now catch up to where she's at. So I'm sneaking in, before she finds out. But thank you for causing a marital rift for me, and we will work through that. We'll see counseling because of you, Steve. But again, a great book. It's a beautiful book. So again, you're going to feel like you're in the south of France when you're reading this book, and I know that's the intent. But a beautiful, well-done book, Steve, and congratulations on this. Enjoy it, celebrate, take your time. You've earned this, obviously. But I'm always curious to see what's next from our authors. So keep us in mind. New projects come up in the future. Absolutely. I'd love to invite you back.
I can almost guarantee there will be another book, and I would like to be able to guarantee that it will not take 10 more years. So
there you go. Awesome. And I'll go work on my French in the meantime. So thank you, Steve.
Wonderful. Thank you. You're so generous to do this. Your whole manner and your attitude about this is just really beautiful. In a world of rampant commercialism and everybody wanting something, the fact that you do this out of the goodness of your heart is just really remarkable.
Excellent. I appreciate that. Everyone, all the information is always in the show notes. Please go support yet another great author. Especially this is the first week of really launching this book to the world. Would love to get those reviews. Those are very helpful for our authors.
Reviews are huge.
Please do that. Please buy a copy for yourself and then send a copy to someone else that you love, because you know you're going to send them a great book. Steve, thank you so much for being part of the show.
Thanks again. It was just a sheer pleasure.
Hey, thanks for being here for the Living the Next Chapter podcast. So glad to have you as part of our family of listeners. There's a seat for you just here on Living the Next Chapter, and I'm so happy that you have listened to all the way to the end. Wow, you are now my new bestie. I want to let you know that I host 7 other podcasts on top of Living the Next Chapter. Yep, 8 total. One of them is called the How To Podcast series. If you are thinking, you know what, Dave, this podcast thing seems like a lot of fun, well, I'll give you a secret. It is. It's a great, amazing, fun time where you can get to meet great people, get your word out there, promote your book, promote what your coaching program, whatever you're doing. Podcasting is great. And if you want to learn how to do this, what you're hearing right now, head over to howtopodcast.ca and look up the How to Podcast series on YouTube, whatever app you're listening on. You'll find me there. And I'd love for you to come listen to How to Do This. And if you're interested and have questions on how to podcast, reach out to me at howtopodcast.ca. Thank you for listening. Talk soon.